we are thrilled to have Dr. Khalil Habib today as our guest lecturer. Dr. Habib is an associate professor of philosophy and director of the Pell Honors Program at Salve, Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island. He is co-editor of Cosmopolitanism in the Age of Globalization, Citizens Without States. He specializes in modern political philosophy, particularly Machiavelli, Montesquieu, and he's also interested in the philosophical foundation of liberalism and classical Islamic political philosophy. His co-edited volume on Shakespeare's political philosophy is under review with Lexington Press. His articles and reviews appeared in such journals as Review of Metaphysics, Vogelin View, and Ancient Philosophy. Dr. Habib graduated from the University of Maine with a degree in political science and received his MA in political science from the University of Toronto and PhD in philosophy under Stanley Rosen from Boston University. His lecture today is on Ibn Khalbun and the golden age of Islamic civilization. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Habib for his presentation.
So I've been told that we should save some time for questions at the end of this presentation. I'm going to invite you to talk at any time. In fact, what I'm hoping to do is rather than give you a boring lecture, I thought we would have an actual discussion of the text. And that way I can at least engage you in the discussion rather than me lecturing to you and then filling you with just dates, facts from Islamic thought that frankly you can find on your own and you don't need me for. So what I want to do is just lay the groundwork for a conversation that I hope you can all have. So if you have any questions at any time, feel free to ask. If I don't know the answer, I will respond in Arabic. So you might know what I'm talking about, so yes, that's okay. So anyone here with a background at all in Islamic philosophy? In Islamic history? Yes? Okay. Yeah, he's throwing your friend down under the bus. Yeah, he knows that. You know, so here's sort of the challenge of studying Islamic philosophy. It's like studying Western philosophy, American philosophy, European philosophy. It is so vast. There's Islamic logic, there's epistemology, there's metaphysics, there's political thought, there's Islamic history, jurisprudence, on and on and on. So what I wanted to do was just give you a very quick thumbnail sketch of how one person in particular that I think you should all be familiar with and read, and that's Peter Adamson. He has a nice division of how to sort of just to begin to approach this vast body of knowledge in terms of just, you know, if you were to do this, and somebody said, tell me something about Western philosophy, you can see the immediate challenge. It's so broad. Where do you start? What do you pick? Well, you all know, just from taking courses here, I hope, we have ancient philosophy, right? Then you have modern, you have medieval, you have postmodern, etc. So what Peter Adamson does, and what I want to do is just follow his outline so that it's familiar to you when you turn to him. He's an outstanding resource. He looks at three primary periods. Now there is, of course, modern Islamic philosophy as not contemporary. But he looks at three. The formative period, he really focuses on the development of an Islamic thinker named Avicenna. Partly because Adamson is a scholar on Avicenna, but Avicenna is a peak. I can assure you, one of the most incredible thinkers you'll ever read. Avicenna wrestles with the following problem. You have in Islam revealed religion, a God who chose to reveal the world and knowledge to man through Scripture. But then you also have Greek philosophy that says something can't come from nothing. And Avicenna is of the view that the world cannot possibly be created, that it has to be eternal. And it has to be eternal on religious grounds. Now, how can that possibly be? Well, God is all-powerful. He can't change. Why could an all-powerful God, a perfect God, not change? Any idea? Yes, sir.
Already perfect, so any change would be.
It's already perfect. All change is change for the worse. Why can't he change for the better?
Already perfect.
You see? So what does that imply? Well, that kind of stick of dynamite thrown into this cultural period now raises the following question. How can the world then have been created if God is perfect? Because that would immediately constitute some kind of change in God. But all change, things that change can only change for the better or for the worse. But a perfect being suddenly starts to look like an unmoved, who can finish the sentence? Who knows what I'm going to say next? An unmoved what?
Mover.
Mover. looks like the God of the Quran is Aristotle's God. The God of eternity, the God of the philosophers. So it's a formative period because there's an attempt, like you can always imagine, when two cultures come together, there's always a mutual exchange of ideas. One pushes and challenges the other. And Avicenna really gets this incredible ballroom where it's a fascinating debate. I don't have an answer to it. I don't know how one cashes that problem out. I can tell you what other thinkers argue. Fine. Then God is not perfect the way you understand perfection. His perfection is that he can will anything. And if tomorrow a squared plus b squared equals broccoli, that's God's will. That is, he can do it. Now, I can assure you that debates on that side are extremely subtle and very, very exciting. And primarily they come from one of my favorite thinkers, Al-Ghazali. He comes towards the tail end, dies in 1111, I believe. It's easiest, I'm not a dates guy, but that's the only one I remember, it's just a bunch of ones. He comes in, and here's what he argues, sort of at the tail end of what's known as the Islamic Golden Age. Contrary to what people think, the cartoon picture of Al-Ghazali is he ends the Islamic Golden Age because he doesn't believe in causality, you know. When you put it in those terms, he sounds like someone who's utterly irrational, you know. You say you don't believe in causality, that means, you know, the floor, I believe, can turn into marshmallow at any given moment because Allah willed it as such. Well, when you present somebody like that, they look like a straw man. Instead, what Ghazali does argue in a book entitled The Incoherence of the Philosophers, okay, the Habib. It's an amazing work. He repeatedly states, constantly, throughout the work, I am not putting forward my positive view on much of anything. All I'm doing in this work is taking philosophers, primarily Avicenna, at his word. And I'm trying to show you that on his grounds, using his assumptions, he does not prove what he claims to prove. That's what Ghazali does. So when he, for example, there are passages in there where he says, well, a God at any moment can make a man into an ass and an ass. Read it carefully, that is not his positive statement. In fact, a book that only recently gets translated into English called On the Moderation of Belief, there you have Al-Ghazali putting forward a positive argument in the favor of causality. So he's not the cartoonish person that he's often presented as. The reason why I want to make a case for him here is that if you want to understand this particular period, you really have to read Avicenna engaging in a conversation with Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali comes later. I'm just taking them out of this historical period, putting them in the same room, and then watching them really debate. It's really amazing. The other thing about Avicenna, and the reason why he's so important, one of the things I want to do in this talk is just be as helpful as possible to any of you who are interested in the history of ideas. And quite often, let's face it, we always go from the familiar and then approach the unfamiliar on what we know more intimately. Avicenna is such a proto-Spinozist, it's unbelievable. Some of the early classical liberalism that comes out of Europe, especially Spinoza, looks shockingly similar to Avicenna. I'm not claiming that Spinoza borrowed or took from, but his work was known in the early Enlightenment period. Dante, for example, mentions it even as early as the Renaissance. People were aware of Avicenna. Does anyone know how the West learned of Avicenna? Who introduced him into the West? The Russians. Sorry?
Wasn't Aquinas?
It was Aquinas. See, Thomas Aquinas, he begins his work being in essence. Immediately makes reference to Avicenna. And he is dealing and wrestling with this whole problem that Avicenna showed him, and that is, wait a minute, can you have faith and reason? Can you have revealed religion on the one hand and reason on the other when they seem to be going in different directions? Reason tells you there has to be a cause and an effect, right? And how could God then affect the world if he's uncaused? So all of these problems start to really push in the Christian world, and the outcome is Aquinas in many ways. The more you read Avicenna, the more you see he was vital in shaping Western thought. So if anything, I'm hoping by the end of this, we break down this Islamic West barrier and realize that it's the nature of ideas to have no boundaries. It's a borderless world when it comes to ideas. And so the gift, the inheritance that you get from this period of time, now, as you're sitting, might look like a historical period, but by the time you really develop an understanding and appreciation, I would even argue early European modern political thought, you'll realize that a lot of it does come, in fact, from Islam. I'm not saying this as an apologist, this is not propaganda. You look at Aquinas' work and you will see that there is a clear attempt to wrestle with these ideas, and in doing so, they get translated, they transfer over to other subsequent thinkers who want to take on Aquinas. So if you're an early modern political thinker and you're taking on Aquinas, you are by default also dealing with Islamic ideas as well. So then the second period is what's called the Andalusian period. I love this period. This period is so fascinating. Obviously it takes place in Andalusia. Here you get the Baghdadi, that sounds like jive, that's not like the Baghdad Aristotelians who introduced Aristotelian thought into Andalusia. This is the period around this time, from basically 1000 to 1200. And I put Maimonides up there, even though he's not Islamic, he's obviously Jewish. This is a fascinating period. I love this period. This period, you start to see the influence of Aristotle coming into Islamic jurisprudence through this figure here, Ibn Bajjah, Abumpus. Ibn Tufail, I'll tell you a little bit about him. He's really fascinating. Averroes, are these any names ring a bell? Anyone not familiar? And then Maimonides, but then you have after this the Mongol period, and that's where Baghdad gets sacked in 1200, and Ibn Khaldun writes post-period, okay, in 1400. And it's relevant, because what he wants to do in this book, the Muqaddimah, is make sense of God's role in history. Now, the reason why all of this is necessary is because what do you think Avicenna's God's role is in history? Do you think this is a personal God who's invested in your particular faith? Do you think this unmoved mover, this God of perfection, is involved in your life, listening to your prayers, hearing them, responding, moved by them? What do you think? Do you think such a... Yes, sir?
Does it attribute free will also?
Say that one.
How does it attribute free will?
How does what attribute?
The actual thought of God being.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
That's Ghazali.
Yeah.
See, you're already in the debate. Yeah, can God have a free will according to Avicenna?
I don't know.
No. Let's think about his sort of axioms and sort of engineer a possibility. Perfection. Necessary.
It's not necessary.
Now, he calls him a necessary existence.
Well, if he's an unmoved mover, is it necessary for you to interact with his creation?
That's a good question. What do you think the answer is?
No. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, look, or the way I like to put it is, who do you want to pray to? The philosopher's God or the biblical God?
I'd rather put with God.
Yeah, you're more likely to get a response. That phone might get picked up. The other one just will ring on to eternity. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, if all of this is based around the Quran, I haven't read the Quran, but I would imagine in all those pages somewhere it says that God listens to your prayers and wants you to pray.
Of course. No. Look, all of the monotheistic religions have a personal God, a God who listens, can get angry, sends prophets. There's no doubt about that. But what's happening in the early period is ideas of Aristotle and Plato are coming in. And now imagine if you're raised on the idea of revelation, the human reason is limited, that it can only be supplemented with the revealed word of God. And that God has a special place in his heart for man and can get disappointed and can hit the reset button and recreate again after a flood. And all of that suddenly gets thrown into turmoil. And it's no wonder by the time you get to the Andalusian period, you have in Maimonides a quest to get rid of this notion that God has anthropomorphic qualities. So when you look at Maimonides' Guide to the Complex, now what I'm hoping to show you is this continuity. I have to start somewhere, so I got to start with dates. But I want to eventually just show you that forget these dates. These are all arguments that are going across time. You're going to also see in one of my favorites, Ibn Tufail, the beginnings of, and you already see it in Avicenna, Farabi, and others. God does not have these anthropomorphic qualities. This notion of a will. Okay, well, will seeks to satisfy desire. So right there, what does that tell you about a perfect? Right. So what the argument then becomes is, all right, well, we still want to believe in God. We know the world is here. Maybe the world and everything that we see, the universe, is an emanation of God in the same way that light emanates from the sun. Right? Now you see how very quickly you're right to Spinoza and it's kind of a pantheistic view where maybe everything is God. Maybe that gets us out of the line. But by the time you get to this period here with Maimonides at 1200, there is an attempt to say, okay, let's try this one more time. We believe in God, but it's getting harder and harder to have a too humanistic a view of God. So perhaps there is a God, but it doesn't have the qualities that we just see around us. Maybe we're just too familiar with human nature, and we tend to project. And that's where we're getting into trouble. We're getting into trouble by endowing God or projecting onto God certain ideas that are human. And let's face it, if humans are imperfect, the last thing on earth you want is a God with those kinds of qualities. So maybe we got to start all over again. So what happens then is you've got this movement to try to save a place for God, but to do it on terms that become either rationalistic or mystical. Okay, so let me just get into that. I'll take your question, and then I want to just show you how in this period you see two paths. Those who go down the rationalist view, where they purge God, if you will, of these anthropomorphic qualities. You know that old Enlightenment, that nasty remark one said that if horses could imagine a God, what would that horse look like? Right? You know the story. Now, my wife's Bahamian. And I remember the first time my kids went down there, we were in the airport, and they saw Bahamian Jesus on a painting. My kids were like, wow, I didn't know Jesus was Bahamian. I'm like, what old hair said? Now, obviously, what you want to do is remove what is this sort of idiosyncratic and get to the essence. And there's going to be two paths. The path of just pure reason, and there you're going to see Ibn Tufail. I'm sorry, Avicenna. Ibn Tufail is going to go down the path of reason is like a ladder. It gets you to a certain view, and then at some point you got to chuck it. And you can only have a mystical union with God. And you see this happen later when people like Heidegger and others reject reason. What do they turn to? Eastern mysticism or some kind of pre-Socratic mysticism of some kind. Really fascinating. Sir, your name.
So, have you just added like 8 books to my reading list, or is this all summed up in that Adamson?
No, it's not. Unfortunately, it's not summed up in any one particular book. What I'm using here with Adamson is just this outline, because I've always found it helpful. Like, okay, here, let's just agree that there are 3 periods that have distinct characteristics to them. And so I'm just using them as handrails for you so that if you find one that you like. So by the end of it, you could say, you know what, I kind of like this Andalusian period. And by the way, I'm happy to share my email with you if you guys want to continue this later. That's fine. If you have a question, if you want a recommendation on a particular work, I'm happy to provide that for you. So let me get to Ibn Tufail, and then I promise you we'll get to Ibn Khalbun, but I want you to see where he is in light of this big conversation. Ibn Tufail, in my view, is one of the most important unacknowledged Islamic thinkers to the European Enlightenment. He is an Andalusian thinker. He writes a story, and tell me if this sounds familiar to you, okay? It's called Hayya ibn Yaqzan, Son of the Living Awakened. And it is based on a bizarre story by Avicenna called The Recital. It's bizarre. It seems that he takes the names only. If you read Avicenna's work, it is so esoteric, it is so bizarre, it's so allegorical. You're pull your hair up trying to make sense of it. Tufail, not as difficult. So here's the story. A young boy is born, spontaneously generated on a deserted island. Like I was. I don't know if you know that. Spontaneously generated, no parents. Why is that an interesting starting point to think about human beings? Sorry, what is your name?
They always come from moms and dads.
Yes, and moms and dads are always located where? With the baby, but also in a political context. So he has no tradition. Is he born to a tradition? He spontaneously generated. So the thought experiment is, what can the human mind know without any reliance on tradition whatsoever? Now, let me just, sorry.
Heuristics. Well, I guess heuristics. Say heuristics.
No, right. I'm trying to, well, according to Pell, yes. But where I was going with this is you get people like Rousseau who come later, who they were all familiar with this work, and then they try a thought experiment. Like in Emile, they have a boy who's just born without contact with society, and then the question of what could such a human being learn? Well, according to Pell, he can come to knowledge of God, and the God that he comes to knowledge of turns out to be Avicenna's God, remarkably. Because without revelation and without tradition, the only kind of God unassisted human reason can discover is this unmoved mover, this first cause, if you will. So he discovers what takes anyone else, revelation, all on his own. He also becomes morally sound. Now, the reason why I bring that up is I'm teaching Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. And he, like Rousseau and others, reject the idea that you can develop any moral qualities without a community. It's absolutely impossible. Anyway, what does this have to do with Rousseau and this period? Ibn Tufayle's work is translated into Latin by John Locke's tutor. You guys know who John Locke is? Pretty remarkable. Takes Europe by storm. Around Locke's period, the book is even translated into Dutch. There were some rumors of who translated it, who knows. But there's a wonderful book. Anyone who's interested in this period should read Samer Atta's work on Ibn Tufayl, the history of the way it got translated. Early American Puritans read it, and they loved the idea. Well, why would they love this story? What do you think would be? Yes, sir.
Maybe for a Protestant, right? Then this is going to be pretty compelling.
Why is it compelling? It's
Well, because then the individual has some sort of access to
You got it.
religious truth.
You got it. And that's, by the way, a very Islamic thinking, right? Islam does not have a papacy. So you can see why the early Protestants absolutely loved this. But do you see also how, when somebody like John Locke and others are reading this, they start to think about a state of nature teaching, where now they're all encouraged to jump into the bushes, if you will, and see where can we discover true human nature. The idea there is already a breakout of the Aristotelian notion that you can't study human beings unless you study what? What did Aristotle say human being is by nature? A political what? Political animal. That means it's literally part of the species to develop morally and politically through politics. And all of a sudden, this Islamic thinker comes along and says, okay, you've missed the boat. If you truly want to understand what a human being is, you have to take away all of the social garbage that gets foisted onto him. You have to go right to the heart. Now, obviously, it's a thought experiment. Nobody, with the exception of myself, is spontaneously generated. But it is a thought experiment. It helps you to put sort of a possibility out there of what might it look like if human beings had no tradition, such as it is. Now, Smith, in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, has passages where he actually says, now suppose somebody was born spontaneously on an island. So this is up in the air. It's in the air. People are reading it, thinking about it. He says, I disagree with anyone who says that such a person can come to any moral qualities. Haya does. Haya almost becomes an ascetic, becomes a devotee of this God. He has a mystical union. And Smith says, impossible. Such a being, born with no contact with human beings, could never develop any moral character. Because for Smith, you require the impartial spectator, you require some social interaction, and that's how you learn right and wrong. Through that kind of trial and error. It's not this intuitionist way of receiving knowledge. You know, it's not through reason. Okay. So what happens? This period that sort of ends around 1204. These are obviously somewhat arbitrary dates, but something does in fact take place that not only gives birth to Khalbun thought, it's actually quite important to understand his work. The Mongol period after the sack of Baghdad rocks, as you can imagine, the Islamic world. What happens? Well, clearly, there's a change of guard. Over time, they adopt Islam. But then, what happens to Islam around the time of Khalbun? Does anyone know? So you have this guy, Tamerlane, 1336 to 1405. He becomes sort of the successor of the Mongol Empire that was established way back when the Golden Age comes to an end around 1258. it rocks the world, as you can imagine. What would you think if the country that you know and love was completely conquered by a foreigner? What would you think? How would you start looking at events in history? What do you think? Absolutely. Absolutely. It's so over everything you know and love and trusted in and believed was the foundation of your being, gone. How do we, now forget this lecture, how do you look at massive historical events? Like when you want to try to understand a massive event, okay, a massive attack on a country, a massive decline, a rise, a spectacular crash.
Is it pre and post?
What are you thinking of?
Yeah, anything like AD and BC and
Yeah, well, like for example, if anyone here familiar with the Augustin city of God? Professor Johnston has some great lectures on it. When there's a massive change of guard in history, don't people? I'm sorry. Well, yeah, you're immediately thinking, what effect? What is the cause to this effect? Now, the reason why I put this up here is because I want to be helpful for you in terms of how to approach Khalil. You're going to see a lot of scholarship out there that tries to compare him to the sociologists out there. Maybe he's like Montesquieu or Kant, or maybe he's like Thucydides. And I want to try to situate this history a little bit. I think it is helpful to kind of make those connections, but just take a breather and think about just how we understand history. How do Americans understand history? When you take a history class, are you given sort of economic causes to events? Are you given, what kind of causes? Yes, sir.
Some war periods.
So you see, your military, is military the force behind history? What did Thucydides say?
It's conflict.
Absolutely, it's conflict, and is conflict rooted in military?
Yeah.
Anyone familiar with Machiavelli's discourses on living? He says there's only one sin, military sins. Okay? So you either have arms or you don't have arms. Okay? So there's a military history. Could you understand the events of 9/11 in terms of military history? Can you try to understand it in terms of economics? Is there an aspect of a commercial republic to reduce all history to economics? Right? Thucydides doesn't write, for example, in economic history. He makes it very clear he's writing military political history, end of story. He's aware of the importance of economics. He knows that, but he doesn't think they're the driving force. And we want to know, what is the driving force? We've just witnessed our beloved homeland completely go. It's gone. We want to know what was the force behind it. Do we look at history in terms of social history? The interactions of social groups? Race, class, gender? Sure. What's interesting is there's one missing. Did it cross anyone's mind here that God is the force behind history? Say a tsunami hits, do you think he's angry? Somebody messed up. Do people look at history with God as the prime force behind it? In the South? No. And where else? Not just the South. Who else looks at world events and thinks, okay, the force behind it is not military, it's not economic, it's not social? Sorry?
I guess I'd say more so and so less. If we go to Dr. Chip's class, we learn more and more of the religious aspects that go into their culture.
Right. And what's interesting is when you put these up on the board, you now start to realize how we look at history. If you're already not even thinking, oh, history, I know the force behind history. It's God and his prophets. How many of you would feel comfortable in an American audience making that argument? Say a massive plague happens. And you're like, sit down, I've got somebody offended Jesus. Do some people believe that? Why don't we? Why is that comical for us? Sir?
I mean, following the Enlightenment, I would say that following the Enlightenment, I'd say that rational thought dictates that there's other means that we can actually observe that cause these things. Like,
What is your name?
Mark.
Excellent. Did everybody hear Mark? Because we are thinking that there has to be some rational cause. Now, what are you already saying about God?
But he's irrational.
Yeah, that is either irrational or beyond the grasp of reason, right? Something like that is taking place in the Muqaddimah. Ibn Khaldun wants to understand what is it that is behind the change of guards in history, massive changes in history. Is it military? Is it economic? And or what is it? Does anyone know? Anyone have any familiarity at all with Ibn Khaldun? You can just any thoughts? No.
I think he's one of the greatest Islamic philosophers. Has a lot of knowledge about
Yes.
Islam.
What is the principle that he argues is behind?
Yeah, what you just said, I guess, the massive change in history and the civilizations.
Yeah, it's this word right here, asabiya. Anyone know Arabic? My sister, you know Arabic? Asabiya. What does it mean? It does mean, yep, it means spirited, doesn't it? Angry. People don't know how to translate this word unless you're Arabic, and you immediately see it when our moms and dads would say, "Hada asabi." What does that mean? He's very angry, right? So it gets translated as group solidarity. Now, doesn't that sound like a team sport? Like the Harvard crew team? Like, look at that, asabiya. It doesn't capture at all what Ibn Khaldun is talking about. Ibn Khaldun thinks that the motor, the force behind history, is this group solidarity, but it manifests itself in blood ties, tribal ties, where people are willing to kill and sacrifice for their tribe, al-asabi. And he thinks that fundamentally, the rise and fall of civilizations can be measured by the strength of the group solidarity at question. The second the Romans grew too big, and they lost that sense of solidarity, what happened to the Romans? What happened? You know? And what happened? And so he wants to understand, well, what is it that is politics then just purely Machiavellian? You either have arms or you don't have arms. Is it just a dog-eat-dog world of predators? Khaldun introduces this term and says, well, not really. There's a character in humans that you can find in tribal desert culture that he argues is the foundation of civilization, the foundation of it. Completely different from any of the Enlightenment thinking. The Enlightenment thinking wants nothing to do with tribalism. That's where you get the individual rights of man and woman. This is different. This is, we are tribes, and human beings are tribal. And the more asabic the tribe is, the more that solidarity holds it together and it can withstand any external and internal threat. When the United States loses its sense of asabiya, you're in decline. You don't feel that you belong in it. It's too divided. To whom do you owe your loyalty? And so this is what he puts on the table, and he says, now watch, is this true? Now, he says there's one other thing that transforms asabiya so it no longer even is needed. Does anyone know what that might be? What? So let's just say there's 4 tribes right in here. And our tribe is our tribe. Now, you have to understand, when Khaldun uses this, he doesn't say it in a disparaging term. He's saying these are the fundamental building blocks of civilization, period. People voluntarily associate with their own. Anyone who disassociates, you got to have some transcendent tribal identity that's going to coalesce you, or you're on your own, and you're going to be weakened and divided. What is the only thing you think? And I understand most of you have not read it, but I think I've given you everything you need to know to sort of puzzle it through. What might be the only transcendent identity that transcends the tribalism of the nomadic life and then unites us in even a bigger community, such that it creates a dynasty? Money? Who said money? That's the Smithian. Not money. Language? No. Allah. Islam. That's why you now see Salve. Submit. All are equal. What's the last surah say about, do you know the last surah? Men, women, all races are all equal in the eyes of God. It's in Islam that you have the transcendent identity. However, here's what's really interesting about it. Islam could not have conquered and could not have been strong had it not been built on the constitutive elements that make up the tribal culture. And that's what we're going to develop today. How much time do I have? 50?
15.
1-5.
Yeah.
See, I'm Lebanese. We take forever to make a point. I'm very sorry. Okay. But we are, you look like you had a question.
I was just wondering, as we're going through all of this and thinking about history and thinking about what's happening now, how does the current discussion fit with what's happening with Pell?
I think that's an amazing question. Let me repeat it in case you didn't hear it. Thinking in terms of what Ibn Khalbun is helping us to think about, how might we think about our current contemporary situation? It poses the question Khalbun is putting forward: are we tribal or not? And if we want to overcome our tribalism, what do you subordinate it to? Do you subordinate it to commerce?
Because that looks purely, as I look at what's happening now, looks purely economic. Yeah, you can say, well, it's political, it's so, no, really, it just looks like economics. Like,
Yeah.
we're gonna get ours and we're gonna take it from you, and some of this stuff I was reading on Al Jazeera this morning about what the other countries are trying to do.
Can I make a case for Khalbun? I had, in fact, a conversation with one of the faculty of the recent election, and we were talking about the roads and the last, et cetera. But let's just try to really look at it from Khalbun's point of view. Let's just assume it's group solidarity. I'll just use the term that everybody uses, so you recognize it in the book. Why did the middle class get rejected or ignored? What really, from Khalbun's point of view, where was the breakdown? Sorry?
In the U.S. or?
Yeah, because you asked about the contemporary, yeah. Would that have happened to a tribe? They're letting their fellows fall behind. Okay, and I'm using tribe there as a broadly construed term. Okay, I don't want you to look at it in a primitive sense, although you guys look at it that certainly.
You look at polarization too.
Okay, now let me ask you this. It is true that there's polarization, but in that tribal sense, could that take place? In other words, what are all these symptoms of? The breakdown of what? The sense that there is no group solidarity, right? And why do you think that the theme, make blank great again, what is he appealing to? You see? And so what does it mean to be great? He articulated economic, military, right? National sovereignty. They're all strength. Who did it appeal to? See, I'm trying to make this book relevant so that it's not just some book, you're part of your history class, your philosophy. Is this picture of human beings accurate or not? And if it is, then you should be able to look at it, update the terms, look around you, and then say, okay, that seems to make sense. If any country loses its sense of solidarity, does it start to decline? So then what is the source of solidarity? And what erodes it? Does commerce build it or undermine it? One more time.
Competition erodes it.
Competition, what kind? Internal or external?
Either or. I mean, if you have inter competition, it's going to erode the fundamental trust you have in whatever leadership.
Brilliant, brilliant. And that's exactly how Khalbun argues a final chief gets placed internally. All these factions, finally the strong guy says, enough. It's the Game of Thrones, right? The Bedouin Game of Thrones, right? Externally, though, external competition strengthens group solidarity. If you read, for example, Montesquieu's Reflections on Rome and Machiavelli, he says the thing with republics is they're really strong when they're threatened externally. America, during the Cold War, how was the solidarity in the country? All of a sudden, we have no external, or we perceive no external enemy. What happens to that solidarity? You see? And so, I'm just making a case so that you don't read this as some antiquarian book, but something that you might want to teach us about it. So can we just go through some passages, because I don't have much time left, and I wanted to just fill out this. What are the key characteristics of these two peoples? Here is how Khalbun is going to educate us about the rise and fall of civilizations. He says that there's two fundamental types. Anyone here familiar with Machiavelli? The Prince? Okay. Just like Machiavelli says, look, there's the people and the great. He just produces all of history and all of logic, people and the great, right? Friedrich Nietzsche, there's master morality and slave morality. They all like to think in terms of twos, okay? So this is what Khalbun is doing. And he says there's two fundamental building blocks to civilization. You've got the tribal nomadic, and then you've got the sedentary urban. Yeah, now the reason why that's true, the Bedouins would be here. The reason why I'm keeping them general is because I don't want you to read and say, but I don't know any Bedouins, so maybe this has no relation. So I'm trying to make it as universal as possible. Just like Nietzsche and Machiavelli would, right? People in the great. Doesn't matter if they're Roman people or Christian people. They're just Roman. They're either the great or the mid. And then sedentary. This is always associated with city-urban life. Khalbun is aware that arts and the sciences come about when human beings reach a state of flight from necessity, where there's some leisure, and you're going to find the arts and the sciences in urban centers. But what happens is human beings get accustomed to luxury here, and they relax the springs of their spirit. Too tempted with luxury, too hedonistic. Nobody seems to be watching. Everything is anonymous. The sense of group starts to disappear because you don't feel like you're really part of anything. So the larger the pool you're in, the more you start to think you're an individual. If you're in a small pool and you're fishing, you're swimming with your school of fish, it's hard to think of yourself apart from your birds of a feather, right? Now in the tribal, yes, it's Bedouin, but I want you to think of it in these terms. This is where life is harsh. This is where necessity bears down upon human beings. Do you think the group is stronger here or weaker? What do you think? Anyone here an immigrant to this country? When the first batch comes in, really tight. What happens after the second generation? Now they're like become lawyers, doctors. What happens to the family unit? You know what happens.
Nuclear family becomes smaller.
Exactly. And the family, I'm just going to use this term, the tribal identity starts to weaken. But what comes about during this period, this period for Khalbun? So turn to page 97. Actually, sorry, I skipped something. The 91. Bedouin civilization was savage nations. Now again, do not think by savage he means some disparaging terms. It's almost like Rousseau's use of the term. He's going to see certain characteristics that he finds quite admirable. Okay? Both Bedouins and sedentary people are natural groups. End of story. There's nothing artificial about city life. This is not Rousseau. This is not that period in modern philosophy that says that all city life is just artificial, the civilization and its discontent. They're both natural. But how would it be balanced? How does one help the other, and how does one corrode the other? It should be known that differences of conditions among people are the result of different ways in which they what? Make their living. It doesn't acknowledge that economics plays a role. But the question is that a factor, or is that the primary force? For Khalbun, it's a factor, not the primary. Social organizations enable him to cooperate. So does he have a place for social history? You're going to see he has a sense of all of these, but none of them are the glue that holds the civilization together. That is going to be group solidarity, asabiyya. Okay? Now, yes, in our modern Arabic it means angry. It also means spiritedness in the Greek sense. There's a republic, a spirited puppy who just wants to help his friends and harm his enemies. It's not a bad thing. Plato calls it, noble little puppies. Skipping down, I want you to see the following. Actually, it is therefore necessary for them to restrict themselves to the desert. He's talking here about life in harsh conditions. If this is too desert-oriented, imagine a period of time in American history where nothing was convenient. Life was tough. You had to be industrious. Things don't just grow off the trees. You can't just sit there and have food pop out of the ground for you. Everything is a matter of will and industry and intelligence. It is therefore necessary for them to restrict themselves to the desert. Their social organization and cooperation for the needs of life and civilization, such as food, shelter, and warmth, do not take them beyond the bare subsistence level. Skipping down. They cooperate for things beyond the bare necessities. Okay? They use more food and clothing and take pride in them. They build large houses and lay towns and cities for protection. These are sedentary. What's the difference between the two? Comfort. And what's interesting is the American dream, built on the Enlightenment ideas of Locke and Montesquieu, is to have a comfortable self-preservation. What's Khalbun saying? That ideal causes on what pressure does that put on the foundation of group solidarity? It erodes it. So your instincts and your ideals are completely in conflict with one another. So do you see where religion will start to play a role? Where will that necessity start to come in from, my friend?
With the Protestant Reformation, didn't they believe in the actual work of the individual? The
Yeah.
work ethic of the
Yep,
individual?
yep,
But
excellent. But in Islam, though, in Islam, where, this is why the final thing I wanted to talk about is religious and political authority. Where will that harsh necessity come from? So that you're not in a situation where you're creating the conditions of too much comfort that erode that glue that holds the community together. You got it. You see, that inner call for religion. He thinks that's how the whole thing comes together. You miss that, and it's built upon the fortitude of the tribe, but I want to develop that for you here. They build large houses, they lay accounts in cities for protection. This followed by an increase of comfort and ease, which leads to the formation of the most developed luxury customs. Dropping down, they build castles and mansions. They provide them with running water. They build towers, etc. Then look at the last sentence. They're sedentary people. Means the inhabitants of the city and country, some of whom adopt crafts as their way of making a living. So he's aware that the arts and the sciences come about through this necessary state of leisure. But look what he says next, though. The Bedouins are a natural group in the world. We have mentioned in the previous section of the inhabitants of the desert about their natural manner of making a living, namely agriculture, etc., etc. Here's what he's going to argue. They are more morally sound than the sedentary life. Why? Let's see how he develops this, and this is going to be important. I'm putting the fundamental blocks together, and then we'll show you why Islam plays such an important role. 93. Bedouins are prior to sedentary people. The desert is the basis and the reservoir of civilization. You know what that means? It is the Bedouin nomadic virtue that becomes the force of cultural renewal in civilizations that are too corrupted by luxury, comfort, commerce. When he says that they're prior to and also the basis, the reservoir, he's saying that there's some that the source of civilization is not urban life. Who here has read Thucydides' Peloponnesian War? At the very beginning, he tells you why it was the greatest war. It's not because he just happened to be there. He says both sides were at their peak, and he starts to define what greatness is and what civilization is. Right, the complete build-up to civilization. So Thucydides is interested in massive cities, and he thinks that that's the source of civilization. Khalbun says it's actually yeah, right. You see the it's the difference. In any event, so I want you to see a couple of other things. So the toughness of the desert life, which is in the middle of 93, precedes the softness of sedentary life. Now you already know right from there, what problems does that pose to a civilization when you have urban culture, comfort, ease? What happens to group solidarity? What happens to that asabiya? What happens to spiritedness? Why does Plato restrict private property for that class? Why does he want to keep them spirited? Why do you want to keep them away from commercial life? Why does Montesquieu want to encourage commercial life? Keep you away from military. I mean, these are the tensions and the questions that come up when you read this book. So, look at 94. Bedouins are closer to being good than sedentary people. That's right, he said. It's in the sedentary, it's in the tribal world, it's in that tough resistance that you find moral fortitude, and you're not going to find it in the cities. Okay? You don't have shows called, the Bedouins in the city. So Sex in the City. Nobody looks at the immorality of the Bedouins because they're not. They're stern, they're tough, their word is their word. The reason for this is that the soul in its first natural state of creation is ready to accept whatever good or evil may arrive and leave an imprint on it. Here he's literally just rephrasing Prophet Muhammad's statement in the Quran. Nobody's born a Muslim, Jew, etc. They're made. So their context helps to shape them. Sedentary people are much concerned with all kinds of pleasures. They are accustomed to luxury and success in worldly occupations and to indulgence in worldly desires. Is that true? Are cities known for hedonistic desire, immediate gratification of the senses? What Khalbun is interested in is the effect that has on fortitude and liberty. Okay? What develops as a moral quality when life is harsh? What develops as a moral quality in relation to your pleasures when life is harsh and driven by necessity? Fortitude. right? In other words, the regulation of your passions, the conquering of those things. And there's an almost a stoic life that emerges in the nomad and an Epicurean life in the city. And what's fascinating is if you read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, you see these two dynamics always in politics. The contrast of the conflict between hedonism and stoicism always are factors in all political contexts. You look at that.
You know, I'm just thinking about, we have a legislator that represents us in Kansas, who can maybe comment, well, the poor will always be with us. And as I listen to some of this, I'm thinking, is this justification for keeping the masses in poverty? Like,
Khalbun?
Yeah. I understand it's like, well, they're gonna be more faithful, more religious, they're gonna be more cohesive,
He
they're gonna work
thinks you
together.
cannot exist as a civilization without a spirited group that can identify with your society and is willing to die for it, period. That's really his argument. It's not so much the Marxist critique of this is all this ideology that he, vested in economic interest. That's not what he's arguing. He's making a simpler and I think what are the
More on morality.
more of, okay, you're about to be attacked, and if you do not have an element within your civilization that has fortitude, courage, a sense of groups, and they identify with the group, they identify what was being attacked, and if they don't have that asabiyyah, okay, you will be conquered.
I'm saying you can't get that unless you're living in very dark circumstances.
He thinks that morality, well, see, this is how we're going to have to develop it quickly, but it's all in the writing. What he's going to argue is fortitude and that sense of, and he's going to say, for example, that the Bedouins always carry weapons. They don't trust their security to anybody. He says they sleep with one eye open, right? He says the problem with the city is you immediately go in and you let go of your weapons. Read Thucydides. Thucydides says when Sparta did that, when Athens, that was a sign of civilization. Khalbun says that's a sign of decline. Human beings should always have the fortitude and the strength to depend, to exert themselves. So what happens in city life is there is a relinquishing, there's a surrendering, a giving up of one's freedom and security to the defense of others. Others will defend you. Where Islam comes in is what speaks to whom does Islam appeal to more? Islam is a tough religion. You've got 5 pillars. It's a lot of demands. Is that for sedentary people? Who is it for? Who does it appeal to? It appeals to that primitive, tribal, and for Khalbun, that is the motor of civilization. Because here's what he's trying to deal with. As long as you have human beings, there's a need for regulation. Either the laws regulate humans or humans, through their own inner will and fortitude, regulate themselves. When he talks about weapons, he's really looking at human beings in relation to their virtue. Do they regulate their own behavior, protect themselves, or are they just completely servile and look to others? Does that make sense? And so what happens is once Islam gets layered into these 2 ingredients, then you can transcend the tribal, and then you become a people, a civilization. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask, is this sort of leading up to his explanation for the fall of Baghdad? Because you have the Mongols,
Yes!
nomadic city, almost cityless civilization.
You got it. Yeah, that's funny you say that. What happened? I mean, think about what's happening. Have you guys ever read Rousseau? If you haven't, I know Dr. Johnson teaches him, so you should. Oh, well. What does Rousseau say happens as soon as a city develops the arts and the sciences? Does anyone know what happens to it? He says a fall happens right around the corner. Because the enervation of the spirit, and there's just a conflict between the development of reason and the fortitude necessary for political life. This is exactly Khalbun's point. He recognizes that there is something great about the mind. Clearly, he's a philosopher. In my view, he's a philosopher. But there needs to be an additional glue to hold people together so that the enervation of commerce and urban life doesn't just sap it. And he does not think that there's a substitute to religion in that regard. He just doesn't. Adam Smith tries to do it with the impartial spectator. There are all these alternatives. Well, maybe this glue. Maybe let's find a way to do it without religion. And Khalbun will say, good luck. You just can't. I can't tell if you have your hand up. Oh, no. Okay, sorry.
For all his work, even in the Middle East and even in America, we still found it, are law, the rule of law on religious grounds.
Right.
No matter where you go, it's still counted in the religious context. So is that kind of where you would go on?
Yeah, I mean, so here, the way I like to present it, that I think we could relate to, either you rule or the state rules. Take your pick. You either rule yourself or someone will rule you. Okay? Historically, that's been, you can argue it all day long, but that seems to be the two options. You can't rule yourself unless you have inner fortitude, unless you have the spirit of virtue, of independence. What Islam asks of you, okay, is that inner fortitude. It's an inner assent to something. You don't feel it's an imposition. He says when the veterans take on Islam, he says it's like a hand in a glove. And that's exactly what enabled Islam to conquer and to maintain its civilization. This gentleman who was talking here, Ibn Khaldun actually met with Tamerlane. Did you know that? He actually met with him and he said, you know what, you proved my theory. Because what you did was you basically rode on the group solidarity of your conquering spirit, and you conquered the people that lost their group solidarity. They were awash in just luxury and commerce and softness. And where is that group? Where is that sense of solidarity? Where's that asabi? You either have it or you don't. You know? Yes, sir.
So would that mean then that if you could replace religiosity with like a totalitarian fascist government, that do the same thing?
Amazing. What a great question. What would be an alternative to religion? Is your question. Yeah, what do you think? I like the alternative that you gave, fascism.
Right, so I mean,
No, let's come off that. Hey, wait till that goes viral on YouTube. That's not what I meant. What I meant was, I like your point, okay? In the Middle East, there was an attempt after the fall of the Ottoman Empire to reconstitute the Arab world. There was pan-Arabism. How did that work? Then there was pan-Islamism. How did that work? Then there was a Baptist. They thought, all right, well, how about fascism? And they were all raising the same question that you're asking. Once Humpty Dumpty falls and it breaks, what brings this thing together? The challenge that the Enlightenment poses is, can you or can you not do it with religion? And what's fascinating about, say, Montesquieu, Persian letters, take a look at Persian letters. He talks about Islam in relation to this aspect of the Enlightenment. He's fully aware of the Khalbuns of the world. He's aware of the strength and power of religion. The question is there an alternative to it? If you've asked that question, you're already not believing in religion.
yeah.
Right? So that's already an Enlightenment prejudice. And the question is Khaldun right or wrong? Sir?
Yeah. So is he saying that there's no alternative to Islam, or because I'm just thinking of a case like World War II when the Japanese were fighting the Americans. And the Japanese were largely a cohesive unit. I mean, they were pretty much as spirited as you could get.
Did they have asabi?
I would say yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, they fell.
Absolutely. But you see, what your question brings up is that relevant in the age of nuclear weapons? And there's a great debate. No, I'm serious. There's a great debate between Montesquieu and Machiavelli precisely on the question of what is the most effective politics. Is it empire or is it commercial republics who can outspend, outwit, and outlast anybody? There's a wonderful book by Paul Ray you should read, and he talks about this interesting sort of trans-historical debate between these two thinkers. Because someone like Montesquieu would argue, yeah, all this group solidarity is great, but if you have a commercial regime that has innovation that actually encourages this life and moves away from this one, you can come up with technological innovations that will render these virtues absolutely superfluous. They're not desirable in their own sake. Who the hell wants to live that way? Is the argument. That these are forced virtues. So when Machiavelli, for example, says in the Discourses, virtue stems from necessity, he's told you it's not choice-worthy. Virtue is supposed to be chosen for its own sake. But if it's necessity that gives birth to virtue, I mean, as soon as you lift that necessity, what should happen to virtue? Who the hell wants it? Right? It's a forced thing on man. So it's a good question that you bring up. But again, what I want to do is make a case for reading Khalbun. Does that change the picture of what brings societies together? Is the United States fractured or not? What brings it together? What brought it together? What will bring it together? What divides it? What strengthens it? Can you do it on economic terms? Can you do it on cultural terms, racial terms, gender, and what? Okay, if you don't want religion, then what are its alternatives? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I remember from Dr. Schiff's class I had this summer about political Islam and the advocacy period.
Yeah, that's it.
How it fell and it came to essentially try to control an extensive empire, and it seems like in history the pattern keeps happening over and over and over and over again.
That's Khalil's point.
No lessons been learned.
No, that's funny you say that. That's Khalil's point. Now, Khalil's not under the illusion, by the way, that this cycle can just be like stop. He's just trying to show you what the constitutive elements are that bring it into being, maintain it, and then destroy it. Are we out of time? We're out of time. Okay. Yes, sir.
I got a question.
Yeah.
So, it's related to the contemporary politics.
Is the what?
The contemporary politics of the Middle East.
Yeah.
What do you think are the powerful reasons that changed Islam from a peaceful, tolerant to a very extreme kind of identity in the Islamic world?
Well, let me tell you what Khalil said. Underlying Islam are pre-Islamic Bedouin tribal factions. It is the case that they are a necessary but not sufficient condition. Why? Because what you don't want are conflicting tribes. What you want is tribes to come together. The only thing that can bring them together, according to him, is Islam. It gives you a trans-tribal, transnational identity through which you can coalesce these different groups. What makes them good for Islam is that they bring to the table a certain degree of fortitude, a certain moral outlook that is necessary for the continuance of religion.